How you doing?
Hey
Hey,
Morgan,
sir, how are you?
I'm fine,
Good.
thanks.
Well, thanks for taking some time to hang out with us for a little bit.
Sure.
nice to see a fellow mustache connoisseur.
Yeah, I'm incognito.
All right. Well, I know you've got a lot going on. Morgan, so this is Casey, just really quick. Casey and I, we have been good friends for a handful of 15 years now. He is there you go. He is what do you do, Casey?
I am an instructional facilitator, so I do all kinds of things, but primarily my job is to help make teachers better.
And he's down in Wyoming, and then I'm up in Montana, and I'm the middle school principal up here in Montana. And we just been running this podcast for about 4 years now, and trying to find different voices to chat about things that we find interesting.
Okay.
And both of us, obviously, we believe in public education and try to promote it. But I recently came across multiple polls that are not favorable to public education. So just some of the numbers would be Gallup says that K through 12 systems show that only 26% of U.S. adults believe that K through 12 schools are headed in the right direction. The same poll says that 35% of all adults are satisfied with their overall quality of public education, K through 12. And I just that's really alarming to me, and it's frustrating to me. And so we appreciate you taking the time. And I'm just going to kind of come out of the gates here with a question, and then we'll kind of go from there. So here is my just generic question, and then we'll kind of go from there. These polls, um, are they a educational? Is it a true indication that education has a problem? Or is it a public relations problem that education has with the public?
Well, I think there's a few different explanations for the decline in the public satisfaction with public education. I think the most obvious of those is that um, there's clearly a campaign going on to try and drive a wedge between parents and parents specifically, but Americans more generally, and the public education system. That campaign is coming primarily from the right, and has been amplified. I mean, I would say it really kicked off in 2021 with the so-called parents' rights movement, which came out of the election in Virginia. But I think there is clearly an effort underway to, paint public schools as out of touch with traditional values, as usurping parents' authority and things like that. So I do think that's a major factor, and that is relatively new. There hasn't, historically, Democrats and Republicans have both broadly been supportive of public education, but you can see a widening partisan gap on that issue, and I think that that's attributable to the messaging. That said, I think there is also some legitimate dissatisfaction with public education around a few different issues, things like the way the public education systems were seen as handling the pandemic. So I think especially in blue states, perceptions that the public education system was closed for too long. I think there are some concerns about the overall quality of the public education system and whether it's really preparing people for success. Just as an example, just last week, there was this big bombshell report from UC San Diego about how so many students were arriving at a selective college, not even ready to do high school math, let alone college math. And so people are concerned about the quality of public education. Um, so, so there are both real and sort of PR related concerns here. I do think that, public education in America doesn't serve everyone well. And lots of students, particularly students who aren't necessarily academically, don't fit in with the traditional academic mode, don't feel well served and well prepared. And but a lot of it also is PR because, frankly, if you don't have kids in the system, it's hard for you to really even have a sense for how public education is doing. And so a lot of that is just about perceptions, what you hear, what people tell you, that sort of.
Is you do a lot of looking at the data. what does the data suggest about students being prepared for college or for life after school? Does the data suggest that public education generically is falling behind, or does the data suggest that kids are going into the workforce or to the next level of education prepared enough? I'll say it that way.
Well, I will say if you stick around long enough, you hear every argument, every complaint 100 times, right? And so
Sure.
it's we're right now I think there is a growing sense that people aren't prepared for college and career, but we also heard that sense 20 years ago, and we also heard that sense 40 years ago, right? I think there's very clear evidence that um, public education was uh, on an upward trajectory throughout the 90s and the 2000s in terms of improving student outcomes. I think there's really compelling evidence on that. I do think there's also compelling evidence that starting around 2013, things seem to level off, and that things have clearly gotten worse since COVID. That there was a sharp decline caused by COVID, and we haven't fully recovered. If you look at things like enrollment in higher education, and completion of higher education, things like that. There is a sense, which I think is accurate, that America was once a leader in those areas and isn't a leader anymore. I mean, that's certainly true, right? Like, countries like South Korea have way overtaken us in terms of the proportion of their adults that have college degrees, for instance. And I think some of that has to do with K-12 education, but some of that has to do with other stuff, other cultural factors, things like that. Um, so and then I would also say that regardless of sort of overall levels, I think we can all agree that there are large gaps in outcomes according to race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, and that the system doesn't work equally well for everyone. Right? That public schools in certain areas. I went to a school in a pretty affluent suburb of Chicago. 90 some percent of kids from my high school went on to 4-year colleges. And so in those places, there's the perception that things are working well. And then I think in other places, there's the perception that systems aren't working as well. I think you can also make the argument, and I agree with this, that the system doesn't do a good job of serving both purposes, right? It's, I don't think it's broadly K-12 systems most of them don't really prepare students very well for if they're not going to go to college, well, then what do you do? And the truth is lots of kids don't go to college or go to college and don't complete college. And you need to be able to prepare those students to do something, to contribute meaningfully, to be able to earn a good income, to live independently, those kinds of things.
Was that the support of which I support, the rise of the trades, in K-12 is supporting the trades and getting kids prepared for the trades?
Yeah, I mean, there's and this is not really my area at all, but like career and technical education and, trade education. I think there's been a resistance, a well-intentioned resistance to the idea that some students aren't going to go to college, they're going to go do a career. And and as a result, we've sort of underinvested in designing good programs for that purpose. And you can understand the resistance or the concern about it, because anytime you say, well, some kids are going to go to college and some kids are not, then the question is, well, who decides that? And how many opportunities do people get, to change their mind and things like that? And is it just the poor kids who are going to be shunted off into careers, and right? So all those kinds of concerns, and you understand those, but at the same time, it's reality. Plenty of people are not going to go to college and probably don't need to go to college to gain the skills that they need to do a good job where they could earn a nice living. And so that, I would say, is another area where I think our systems, again, well-intentionedly, don't set some kids up for success.
So, Morgan, when I knew you were coming on the show, I was super excited because I knew you could give us a broad perspective of things, and we're usually more boots on the ground, like what can we as leaders and classroom folks do. But I know your expertise is going to help me understand this better. So, where we're currently at with regard to education, I've thought some of it is COVID, some of it is policy, and some of it is just societal change. And maybe there's something I'm missing. But from those three things, COVID, policy, or societal change, which do you think is having the greatest impact on our public education system right now? And maybe what would be the best way to attack that?
I mean, the question of why have things turned sort of south in the last 10 years, if you accept that premise, which I pretty much do. Um, a lot of people are trying to figure out what that's about, right? And certainly COVID had something to do with it. But I think really, if you're asking me my opinion, that societal changes, societal pressures are really putting a lot of weight on the educational systems, and they don't really know how to respond. So the I think the example that we're all most familiar with is technology, devices, distractions in the classroom, things like that. And I think we don't have like the most airtight evidence on this, but the fact that state after state after state is passing bans or restrictions on the kinds of devices that you can have in the classroom, I think is a response to what seems like pretty compelling evidence that these devices are distractions, that they're not good for kids' mental health, that even adults have a hard time, you know, uh, using these devices in ways that are productive and not harmful, let alone teenagers. And so to me, there's that. There's also other things going on in society. Like I mentioned earlier, this issue of the widening partisan divide. Again, you didn't really, for a long time, you had Democrats and Republicans broadly in agreement on that there was a reform agenda. It had to do with standards and accountability and, raising expectations and things like that. And then, and even some school choice, right? Even, people forget Barack Obama was a fan of charter schools, for instance. And then, frankly, with the election of Trump, and since then, there's been a widening partisan divide. And I think that, and an increasing toxicity, I would say, in our politics. And you could argue over who's to blame for that. But in any case, I think those things also clearly spill into the classroom, right? And so you have the perception, um, you have the perception, real or imagined, that, for instance, teachers are indoctrinating students with leftist ideologies, which I think doesn't pass the smell test in 99% of school districts, but probably there are a few places where that sort of thing is happening. And then, similarly on the right, you have the reaction to that stated concern as well. Then we're going to we're going to enact a history curriculum that doesn't really talk about slavery and the role and the effects of slavery on, on America. So,
So,
I-
Morgan, can I interrupt on that? Because I
yeah,
think you're hitting on a topic that Casey and we've tried to kind of talk about, and we're a little bit nervous to kind of talk about it because it is so political. And once you get political, it becomes very emotional. And
yeah,
we desperately believe that once you get emotional, very few facts and reconciliation happens. But I have argued for a while that public education is the battleground for somebody else's war, and
uh-huh,
we suffer the consequence for the Republicans and Democrat Party fighting over whatever. I
totally.
agree with you because I'm boots on the ground. I don't the smell test that we're indoctrinating kids. I don't smell that,
In
and
here.
and it doesn't happen here. It doesn't happen in the schools that I'm a part of. However, it does happen, and when it does happen with a teacher or two, that makes national news, and that's
Right.
what emboldens these perspectives. And so, I guess my argument would be, and we can get lost in this argument of politics are to blame for the decline of perception of public education. What I want to focus though is what is a perception? If a large percentage of Americans are dissatisfied with public education, what is a perception that you feel like? Because a lot of our listening audience is parents, they're just parents
Uh-huh.
who send their kids to public education. What is a perception that is one of the key driving low hanging fruit arguments that is simply not true about public education?
Well, interestingly, and I didn't say this in answer to your first question. Well, and I don't have these numbers right in front of me, but um, while it's true that perceptions of public education, but have declined somewhat, that when you ask parents about how their kid's school is doing for their kid, that those results are much more positive, and I think haven't maybe declined quite as much. I don't. Again, I don't have those numbers in front of me, but I could look them up. And I do think that, um, yeah, so I think that, most parents they're not like ecstatic about everything that they see in their kids' school, but most parents are broadly satisfied and feel like their school is full of teachers who care about their children, you know, hardworking individuals. They don't see that kind of crazy indoctrination that people are claiming is happening. They don't see it with their own eyes. And so that's, again, it's like parents, I think for the most part, again, are pretty satisfied. Of course, there are plenty of exceptions to that. It's more the general, it's more when you ask about the system that people are dissatisfied. And,
My
that's
school is
fine.
fine, but the system is not.
Right, right. Which is a, kind of a similar thing to when you ask people about Congress, right? People broadly like their congressperson, and Congress people get reelected 90% of the time. But then you ask them about Congress and they think Congress is a bunch of idiots who do nothing. And so it's a similar phenomenon. Um, I don't know that that answers your question. You might need to restate your question
Well,
for
like,
me to
the
answer
question
it. But
is, in your understanding, in your viewpoint, your studies, is there a low-hanging piece of fruit of misunderstanding that you think is driving a false perception of public education? And Casey, you can answer that too. If you, I know you're involved in thinking as well. So
I
both of you
mean,
can answer that question.
I think broadly people have a range of misconceptions about education. I think that, one answer is people have no idea what goes on in education, right? I think there's there's this sort of funny phenomenon where because everyone went through schools, everyone has a strong opinion about schools and how systems should be run and things like that, but no one understands systems or policy. And the truth is that I think this issue of what I just said, right? It's like all of us went to school, and most of us went to like one or two schools in one or two towns, and we saw one or two systems. And we don't realize that what is public education? It's 13,000 school districts with 50 states, all these different policies. Every school is different. We probably think of our own school as typical, but you're in Montana, your school is small. I don't know where you are, but like the modal school district in the United States is like teeny tiny. Um, and so I think that's part of what drives people's misperceptions is they get too hung up on their own experiences, what they think themselves. I think other than that, like how would you even know what goes on in schools? We did a survey where back when people were in the sort of early days of this parents' rights movement, when people were worried about, you know, um, indoctrination in classrooms and teachers teaching about inappropriate racial and LGBT topics, we asked people, are these topics being, do you want these topics to be taught, and are they being taught? And like 90% of people don't know. I mean, people don't know what's being taught. And
Is that
how
partly
would
the
you?
problem?
Well, how would you know what's being taught? I mean, unless you're in a classroom. I mean, the reality is once a teacher closes the door, any teacher can teach whatever they want for the most part. But it's so all you get is the messages you hear. All you get is a combination of your own experience and the messages you hear about what's being taught. And as you say, it's very easy to pick up some extreme example. Some teacher uses some totally inappropriate worksheet that they got from Teachers Pay Teachers, and and that gets
Are you
splashy and is
saying
all
Teachers
over the
Pay
news.
Teachers is not a certified curriculum?
I'm gonna jump in.
What does Casey have to say? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to jump in here on a couple of points, and then actually I would like to get into a little bit about your thoughts on curriculum and its impact on education, because I think that probably is something that you've spent a lot of time with. But here's a couple of thoughts I have super quickly. One, I don't know how it looked everywhere across the country, but I know there were lots of cases during that COVID shutdown where grading was paused, instruction was minimal, and it was the parents that were supporting that. And if that became the perception of what education looks like, man, if I was a parent and I thought that's how school is, it's 15 minutes of work and then my kids just do whatever they want the rest of the day, I would have had a problem with school too. And I don't know if there's a lot of parents that just got really confused about education and what it looked like just based on that little bit of experience. Do you think that's a little bit of it?
I do think that's true. I mean, the COVID certainly opened a window into education that lots of parents don't hadn't had before, and I do and a lot of people didn't like what they saw for various reasons. You just named one. I do think there is some truth though to things like um, the lowering of expectations. There's a sense that standards have been lowered. Grade inflation is clearly a real thing, right? GPAs are going through the roof at the same time as test scores are going down. And not that we would expect those things to be in lockstep, but we might expect them to be a little bit related to one another. I think also, it slipped right out of my head, but I do think that there is some truth to some of these concerns. Things like, again, well-intentioned policies that, like, for instance, you give someone a 50% if they turn in an assignment, even if they didn't get any, even if they didn't get any of the content right? Like, not that those things are happening in every school, but they're happening in enough places, and people are seeing that, you don't, it doesn't seem like you have to show up and work that hard to do well. And that, I think, you know, that doesn't make people feel good about the system, right? And then I think you get, kids get passed along, and then, there's sort of social promotion. And then we have, like I mentioned earlier at the start of I think I mentioned earlier, this report from UC San Diego about kids showing up at an elite university and they're doing middle school math because they've been passed along all the way through the system. And, again, that's just not making people feel good about that this is a good system that's, doing things well, and making sure that kids really know stuff before they get passed on to the next grade. And I think one upshot of all this is there is a little bit of a cultural change around things like how hard you have to work and how much do you have to show up. And we see that, for instance, in the rise in chronic absenteeism. Yet another well-intentioned idea of, oh, well, let's put all the assignments online so that people can make up for them. But then that implicitly sends the message that being in person doesn't actually matter anymore. And it's really easy to make up if you're absent. And so, sometimes you just need to be there. So I think all these things are kind of in the same
Very
ballpark.
complex.
Can I ask a question? Because you did talk about something that is, I think, at the epitome of education is all of these contradictory concepts and ideas that make decision making that difficult. So, for example, research tells us that if we hold a kid back, that they won't actually improve. But also, if we send them on, they're going to miss the skills, and they're probably not going to be better for that either. What does it look like to resolve some of these conflicts?
Well, I think that, that's a great example because you're right on what the research says there. But the research also says that if you have a good test-based retention policy, like in some of these states that have implemented test-based retention policies, and then when the kid gets retained, you actually do something different,
Hmm.
meaning you give them more intense targeted instruction and supports, then that actually results in better outcomes. So yeah, retaining kids and then doing the same thing, and that's not going to make things better for them.
You
But
mean like
retaining
it's
kids,
kind of like sending the kid to detention or to in-school suspension, not teaching them any skills, just
right?
isolating them for
And
a
then
week.
wondering why their achievement is bad. Yeah, right. Why
Yeah.
they're not learning stuff. No, exactly. Right. Like, you got to figure out what the problem is, and then you got to do something about the problem. And so that, I think, so you're right. But so a blanket statement of retention is bad, that I disagree with, because I think well-designed retention policies that actually provide the supports that kids need can be a good thing. And we have actually good evidence of that.
When you say test-based retention policy, are you talking about like demonstration of mastery, or what do you mean by that?
So, well, I mean, I'm sure you've heard about the so-called science of reading movement, which is happening in lots of different states right now. I don't know if your states have policies in that regard, but the sort of darling child that everyone talks about is Mississippi, where they started this earlier. And one of the elements of their reading policy there was a test-based retention where third graders have to demonstrate, I don't know what the threshold is, they have to demonstrate a certain level of reading proficiency in order to be promoted to the next grade. And if not, they're retained and given additional intensive supports and interventions. And there's pretty good evidence that those kinds of policies in the early grades can be beneficial. I think the evidence on retention in later grades is that it's always bad. But in the early grades, if a kid really isn't reading at grade level, if they're really far behind, I think there's pretty compelling evidence that you can address those problems and they end up better off as a result.
Okay, I want to ask a question because we're hanging out at the 40,000 foot view here, and I love it in many ways, and then I also get really discouraged and frustrated by it. And we keep using the friggin' word policies, and I hate policies largely because they use an example in Mississippi and then apply it to California and Montana, and we're not Mississippians, and we don't have those same struggles, and we don't have those whatever. So can you just speak quickly on this 40,000 foot view on the destruction or how policies generically are, because if we talked about education being the battleground for politics, we're also this weird battleground where a federal policy of instruction or expectations is made by people who have no experience in the classroom, and they pump it out to everybody, and we all have to kind of make sense of it, and it doesn't work. And that too is causing frustration, it's causing destruction, and it's aiding in this a narrative that public education is suffering. So, do you have any opinions just on the sweeping policies of nitpicking stories that we like, and maybe it worked in Mississippi, so therefore it must work in North Central Montana?
Well, I would be curious about which specific policies you're objecting to. I mean, the truth is that the federal government doesn't do much with regard to policy that actually impacts what goes on in schools. The federal government mostly is a conduit for three things: one, money; two, various civil rights enforcements; and three, data. Most of the policy in the U.S. happens at the state level or the
Sure,
district level.
sure.
And, so, but I do think it's the case that sometimes, and this happened before too, that we see something that we think is working in one state and then it gets spread to a lot of states. So earlier on, it was actually testing and accountability, which people thought was working in North Carolina and Texas, and ultimately, and then Bush got elected, and that's what led to No Child Left Behind, which really spread it nationally. Although that was a movement that was already percolating in a lot of states and probably would have happened in most states anyway. Um, I think that you, I mean, the truth is that this is my opinion. I study policy. I'm a professor of education policy. So clearly, I believe that policy can be good for schools and education. In fact, I'm writing a whole ass book about how policy can improve education, how broadly we know how to improve schools through policy. We're just not doing it. Um,
Can you
so,
say more on that? I'm intrigued by that statement right there. Or
yeah,
just
I mean, the basic premise of the book is that there's a lot of bad ideas that get in the way of improving education through policy, and those bad ideas come from left, right, and center. So, examples of bad ideas might be um, that money doesn't matter in education, right? And you work in a school, you tell me that money doesn't matter, and that we can't do more with if we have more resources. That said, of course, it's not that there's a one-to-one correlation between more dollars and better outcomes.
I have a
But
new
lots
a
of
new theory, which is we should do less with more.
right, right, yeah, yeah. Right. So there's that. There's those kinds of ideas. There's these ideas that like fixing it is quick and dirty, and there's like one little thing that we can do that will make it better. Right. So like all the various technology things, like we're gonna have Chromebooks or we're gonna have whatever. Like all those, now it's AI, right? Like those things. Again, that's not gonna. Education is fundamentally a social enterprise between teachers and students, and so
Mm.
no, we're not going to solve it that way, or that free markets are going to miraculously solve education. Again, we have ample evidence that that's not the case. So, so that's the idea of the book, right? It's meant to be kind of obnoxious and uh,
It's a whole
uh,
ass book too, huh?
it's a whole ass book. Yeah, I'm writing it. It's due. So I shouldn't spend so much time on podcasts. I should be writing my book. But
Especially with the two of us, because we can't
yeah,
even take anything seriously. That was the great moment Brian had the other day when we were talking about, resources, and he laid it on do less with more. And I'm like, well, that's perfect. We can sell that. So uh, here's a follow-up question. If we were to have a focus area, and I think your answer is going to be curriculum, I'm guessing, but I don't know for sure. But if there was one thing we should focus on, what would it be? Would it be curriculum?
to improve outcomes for kids. Is that the
Yeah.
question? Or
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry.
I mean,
I was several thoughts in. So
yeah. Yes, you can't have a good school that's doing a good job with kids without a good curriculum. And curriculum doesn't necessarily mean a paper and pencil textbook, but it means that learning experiences are coherent, that you have goals in mind for what kids are supposed to learn, that teachers are prepared to implement a curriculum, that they, when they see that things aren't working well, that they can modify and supplement, but not by going to teachers pay teachers in ways that are good and that actually
So
make
I'm
things
going to
better.
push back on this on both of
Sure.
you, and I'm the dumbest one in the room here, so this is not going to go well for me. But I think that what you just described has nothing to do with curriculum and everything to do with the teacher. And so it is the teacher who is the number one impact on student improvement. And I would argue that you could have the best curriculum and mediocre or shitty teachers and not learn, but you could have a shitty curriculum and fantastic teachers, and those kids will learn and they will improve and they will be fine.
But the thing about it is that there aren't 3 million best teachers in the world. And so you have the teachers that you have who are wonderful people and very hardworking and care about kids. But uh, a, a large proportion of a lot of people need good resources to be able to do
Agreed.
that job well, right? And so
Agreed.
I think, yes, you are right that in the case of the outstanding savant teacher, they probably don't need a really strong core curriculum, but the modal teacher in the US schools is not that. And
I agree.
this is
So
not me
you're
bashing
going to get me all
teachers.
sorts of riled up here because we've already established that schools have finite resources, especially financially. We are very, very limited. And so whatever resources I have in my school or in my district, if it's limited, I would rather invest that money in the people rather than buying new curriculum, because what I experience is I have a building full of people that I love, that are well intentioned, who choose a life of service that will not give them financial freedoms in the future and retirement. And we spend a bulk of our time and money on pushing into curriculum, teaching about curriculum, buying curriculum. And I would love to say, stop doing that, pump that into teachers. And I mean, in all reality, ChatGPT can create me a decent curriculum.
God.
Um, well, but
I'm just
good
going
as
to sit
like
back for a second. I want to hear the
I'm just
response.
saying, like we have educators who are intelligent. Give them state standards and let them work on creating a curriculum and let the teachers drive it. If a fantastic curriculum in the hand of a shitty teacher or mediocre teacher is just as good as the teacher that's teaching it. That's what I think.
Well, you're not going to like the section of my book where I say that a bad idea is that we should just hand everything to teachers.
No, I
Um,
don't think hand it to
I
them and then walk away. That's also that I think that we steal the role of a principal, which is the instructional coach, and that principals should be spending the bulk of their time in classrooms with teachers guiding instruction. So don't just give it to them and walk away. But
Yeah. Again, I
that
just think that I understand your perspective. And your perspective, I think, makes sense from the perspective of a person who works in a particular school and
sure,
wants to improve that
sure.
school. I just think the reality is we have 100,000 schools and 13,000 school districts, and the variation in capacity is tremendous. And the idea that we're going to improve education as at a systemic level by working individually through 100,000 schools and 13,000 districts does not make
If they
sense.
start
Yeah.
hiring shirts and ties, we can change it.
So, well, actually, let me ask you this, because I think really um, because it is no doubt the greatest impact on what happens in a classroom is the teacher. The research does
Of
tell us that
course.
piece,
Yeah.
no doubt. But to me, what the curriculum is the tool through which we are able to give teachers of varying abilities a purpose, a focus, an area to think about and collaborate on and improve on. What I think is that without that curriculum, you just have a bunch of individual people going their own direction. And I think the curriculum is that piece that ties them all together. And that's the thing that's going to keep the bottom, the lowest level raised up to a reasonable level.
Right, right. Yeah.
Is
I agree with what you
curriculum the
just said.
law to the Wild West?
Say that
I don't
again.
know what that means.
Is curriculum to the law to the Wild West? What I'm saying is, like, we had the Wild West full of a bunch of people and they all just kind of did their own thing and enforced their own laws. So then we made holistic laws, generic laws that enforced law and order for everybody. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, if we all, I'm trying to argue for you, but I just don't like it, which is curriculum puts everybody on the same page.
Well, I think there's a lot of advantages to having a high quality curriculum in front of teachers. I mean, I think that, a clear one that I would say is that when you have a good curriculum and you implement it and you see what's working and what's not working, you can iterate over time. A really nice example of that is my own teaching. I teach statistics to our PhD students, and choosing a good book and then implementing that book, over time, and learning about what's working and what's not working and what I need to change in the presentation. Like, you just can't do that if there's not something coherent. Another thing I would say is a lot of kids move, and if they don't move, they go across grades. And the idea that it's got to be vertically coherent at a minimum, right? So that, the learning experiences make sense. I don't think that you have to buy an off-the-shelf book. I'm not even going to say that you can't use ChatGPT to create a curriculum. But what I will say is, if you do that, what you'll need to do is, over time, you'll need to learn what's working well and what's not
Sure.
working well in that
Sure.
curriculum, and you'll need to make changes to it.
Are you
You have a
saying that ChatGPT is similar to Teachers Pay Teachers? Which one's better?
I think
It's
he
actually
left us.
it's actually a very good question. I'm not going to weigh in on that, but it's a good question.
I think he's had enough of us. Actually, I want to do this. Can you define curriculum for us? Because maybe that's part of the hangout.
Well, I mean, I would say that curriculum is any materials, digital or real, that are being implemented as part of the learning experience in the classroom. So most people, when they think of curriculum, they think of like a textbook. But these days, we know that curriculum can be a digital textbook, or a a digital curriculum that's not even like a book, that's just a series of lessons, or something that's adaptive. It can also be whatever crap the teacher pulls in from Teachers Pay Teachers or whatever other website, or anything that they create themselves. And so that's what I think of when I'm thinking of curriculum. It's the whole body of stuff that gets implemented in the classroom.
So who should be responsible for deciding what is valid curriculum and what is not?
Well, this is an area where we're certainly going to disagree, which is that I think that I don't know that in every grade and subject, but I think this is the fundamental role of states, and states should be putting a stake in the ground about what are some good quality core curriculum materials that they think students should have access to. It's not going to be one. It might be a handful of them, and schools and districts should then adopt from that list. I think the idea of individual schools and districts trying to figure this out on their own does not make sense. And lots of districts don't have the capacity to do that. And I think there are real advantages we see from places like Mississippi or other states that have done a more centralized curriculum adoption approach and then supported it with state-provided or state-identified professional development aligned with those materials.
There it is. Yes.
That offers some real advantages. So I actually wrote my first whole ass book about this topic, which was really about the role of states in curriculum reform, and arguing for this idea, which a lot of states are now pursuing. I think first with the science of reading, and now moving into other subjects as well, that states should have a little bit of a more muscular role in ensuring that all students have access to a high quality curriculum.
What role do standards at a national level or a state level have in this conversation?
Well, I was an early advocate of standards. The first 10 years of my career were all about standards. That was what my dissertation was about. I was a big believer in standards. I kind of think standards are a distraction, and I think that actually individual teachers shouldn't really spend much time thinking about standards. I think that standards are useful for curriculum writers. And then beyond that, I think most of the time when you to go and look at a standard and then have to figure out how you're going to implement that standard through one or more series of lessons, let alone the 40 standards in mathematics. Or if you're an ELA, or if you're an elementary teacher, you're going to have multiple subject standards, right? Like, that is just not possible. And so I really think that I think that it was a mistake to think of standards as a teacher-facing document, and that really curriculum materials should be the teacher-facing document.
So Follow-up question, standards-based grading then, is that a no in your mind?
I don't have enough of an opinion. I don't have enough data on that to have a real strong opinion on that. What I care about, I would say more, is that grading actually means something, that it does convey something about how much the student know and can do. Um, and so whether that's standards-based grading or whether that's more holistic grading, I don't have a super strong opinion about. I do think that there is something valuable to parents about being able to report something that's a little bit less
Concrete.
granular than standards-based grading, because parents don't understand 36 standards and, satisfactory and not satisfactory. I mean, I think that's a little bit of an issue, but I'm not opposed. I mean, in principle, it makes good sense, right? I just think in execution, I'm not sure that I think that it teachers can do it, or that students are really using it in the right way. So I don't know.
So I kind of want to come back to this because maybe it's an underlining discussion that we have at least in my district level, and I think it's a national level, that when we have this big divide between public education and the public perception, we end up spending a lot of time on public relationships and communication, and you got to tell your school's story and that kind of stuff. Um, is there legitimacy to that, or is that kind of, you said standard being a distraction? Is that kind of a distraction that we're spending a lot of time and resources on this thing and it's not producing what we need it to produce?
Um, well, I would say, listen, ideally, um, the system will be producing outcomes that speak for themselves. I think that's kind of not the way the world works anymore. I don't know. That doesn't seem like it is, right? It seems like you kind of have to. It seems like you kind of have to make your case for yourself, maybe more than you used to. I don't know. But I think that's true in a lot of different areas. I hate the thought of like schools and districts having to do a lot of stupid PR, right? Like that doesn't seem to make any sense. At the same time, we also have, I don't know what the situation is like in Montana, but a lot of states have really expanded market-based approaches to education. And so now there's all sorts of increased competition with private schools and things like that. And so that does, in some ways, force public schools to do a little bit more marketing, right? All of a sudden, well, I would say it could force schools to just get better. I mean, the theory is that
Okay.
it forces schools
Yes.
to get better.
Yes.
I'm not sure that that's actually what happens. I think what actually probably happens is it forces schools to do more marketing. Um,
So, okay,
but
I wanna rest on that because you were leading into my question. I think that's a
okay.
fantastic discussion. Is competition good for public education?
Um, I think that I mean, clearly, again, this is going to be in the book. I think there's pretty compelling evidence that um, that well managed competition with some good guardrails and accountability can actually make things better. That schools actually do respond to those competitive pressures. Um, but unfortunately, and we have evidence of that from both charter kind of studies and voucher kind of studies. But unfortunately, I think what happened is a lot of the policies that are getting passed have no guardrails at all, and no accountability for the non-public options. And so that's a case where really no one knows what's happening in those schools. It's the total wild west. And we have pretty compelling evidence from multiple states that those kinds of systems don't make things better for kids. So I'm okay with some choice and competition, but it needs to be in the context of meaningful monitoring and accountability, or else I think it's pretty clearly not going to work.
Hmm.
And it's also, I would say, it's just plainly not a panacea. The early ideas on choice were that it would really revolutionize the system. And there's a really good piece by this guy, Doug Harris, about all the ways that education doesn't work like a regular free market, and why those kinds of that way of thinking about education as the choice is going to solve all our problems. It just doesn't work. So I fully bought into that.
Okay, I like that a lot. I've often believed that this competition could make public education better because we just need to step up our game. We're one of the only industries, if you want to use that word, that has a guaranteed customer service, so we don't really have to shift according to the customer. but now with charter school and vouchers and homeschooling, we have competition, but we don't play by the same rules, and so it's
Yeah.
difficult. Um,
Right.
so
Right.
I appreciate that. Thank you for clarifying that. That was good. Casey, what else you got?
I don't have any other questions, and I am going to have to go pretty soon. And I am sure Morgan's had enough of us and is regretting that he can't get this hour back. So
That's
we
fine.
should probably wrap it up here pretty soon.
Morgan, what we try to do here when we wrap up these shows is we try to do a little bit of a takeaway. You obviously bring a lot of the information, so you can instead of a takeaway, maybe you give us one last parting piece of advice. But Casey always starts us off with takeaways. Casey, what's a takeaway of today?
I think I'm going to hang on to this idea that systems matter. Give me 1 second.
I'll go while that's going. I'm gonna. I mean, I still believe that the key indicator for success in public education is the teacher, and I think that it is the people in the building. I do appreciate that there needs to be some guidance, and there needs to be a curriculum. I'm not saying get rid of curriculum. I just think that I'd rather have a crappy curriculum and good teachers. But I think the statement that you made about standards being curriculum for the curriculum and the curriculum being for the teachers, that delineation makes a lot of sense to me because we hear a lot in our district as well, standards-based grading and in teaching according to the standards. And that makes a lot of sense to say, no, the standards should guide curriculum, not instruction. I like that.
All right. And so my takeaway, which by the way, I like that because I've been saying pacing guides be damned. Maybe I can say standards be damned now. I don't know. I don't know if I'm quite ready for that, but maybe. No, I am going to hang on to that systems matter because I think that if we have a teacher who is struggling, who is failing, who is not able to teach the students, we have to have some way, some measure, some access point. And to me, that's what curriculum does. So I'm going to hang on to that piece.
Yeah, thank you. Morgan, any last parting words for us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would just say, listen, I totally agree with you that teachers are the key to everything. That I think is undeniable. The challenge and why I don't lead with the sort of teacher first approach to policy is changing I mean, the teachers that we have and the teachers that we have are the ones that we have, and changing who's in the schools, that's a decades long project. And and changing them through professional learning is also a real challenge too, because people kind of are who they are. So that's one of the reasons why I focus on other kinds of things like curriculum, because I think that the teachers that, you can talk about how we'd like to change the system so we recruit all these better people into the classroom, or that, they're higher performing or whatever, but that's a decades long approach. Right now we have kids in classrooms who can't
Yeah,
read. And so I think that broadly you need a good curriculum in order to be able to do things better right now.
I like that. I can take that. All right. Well, thank you, Morgan, and good luck on your book. We look forward to seeing it published. And yeah, whenever you're ready, we'll do a book talk.
Okay, thanks a lot. Nice to meet you
All right.
guys. Take care.
You too.
Yeah, we'll see you. Take care.